Welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling stories in American history. Today, we'll step back in time to explore events that sent shockwaves through the heart of the Midwest in the winter of 1904, a period when Illinois still reflected the growing pains of a nation in transformation. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I'm always interested to see who's following along with this chilling tale. At the dawn of the 20th century, Illinois stood as a land of striking contrasts. Chicago was rising fast, an industrial powerhouse filled with new immigrants chasing opportunity and modern life. But once you left the city's bustle behind, the state's interior told a different story. Quiet, rural, and untouched by the rush of urban progress, Central Illinois was a place where time seemed to move with the rhythm of the seasons. Scattered farming towns thrived on tradition and hard work. Dirt roads wound through miles of cornfields and wheat, connecting families who had known one another for generations. Life was simple, but it carried an unspoken code. Privacy was sacred, and secrets, when they existed, rarely left the confines of a family's walls. Amid this serene setting, something deeply disturbing began to unfold. Sangamon County, situated in central Illinois, was widely known for its rich farmland and industrious people. The state capital, Springfield, stood nearby. But our attention turns to the lonelier, wind-swept outskirts where isolated farms stretched endlessly, separated by miles of snow-covered land. The winter of 1904 came with a particular cruelty. The biting cold of the Midwest showed no mercy, and heavy snow blanketed everything in sight. Days were short, nights endless, and the world beyond the faint glow of kerosene lamps was consumed by darkness. January brought temperatures that plunged far below freezing. Locals were used to hard winters, but this one felt different, harsher, more unforgiving. Roads disappeared under drifts for days at a time, cutting neighbors off from one another. Each farmhouse became an island trapped in an ocean of white silence. In such a world, people depended on one another for survival. If someone failed to appear at church or a town gathering, concern spread quickly. On January 15th, a farmer named Thomas Brennan noticed something odd on his way to the small village of Mechanicsburg. Riding along the frozen road, he passed the Hartley property, a family well known in the area. Under normal circumstances, smoke from their chimney would have curled into the sky, a comforting sign of life on a morning this cold. But this time there was nothing, no smoke, no sound. The farmhouse stood still, lifeless against the snow. In weather that hovered near 20 degrees below zero, such silence was more than unsettling. It was dangerous. Thomas had known James Hartley for over a decade. James, a hard-working man in his early 40s, managed a modest but successful farm with his wife Margaret, a quiet, respected woman who kept mostly to herself. They had no children, something that people occasionally whispered about but never openly discussed. The Hartleys were steady, devout members of the village Baptist church, the kind of couple who rarely drew attention. Thomas hesitated. It wasn't his way to intrude on another man's property, but something about the stillness gnawed at him. The house seemed abandoned, almost frozen in time. No movement, no warmth, just the whistle of the wind across empty fields. He dismounted, tied his horse to a fence post, and crunched through the snow toward the front door. He knocked once, then again, no answer. Calling out their names, he was met only with silence. That's when he noticed something peculiar. The front door wasn't completely shut. A small gap let the icy wind slip inside. Slowly, he pushed it open. The hinges groaned as the door swung inward, revealing a room swallowed by darkness and cold. His breath caught, not from the chill alone, but from a sense of dread he couldn't shake. "James, Margaret," he called again. Nothing. The interior was in disorder, but not as though a struggle had taken place. More like the occupants had left in a hurry. A chair lay toppled on its side, plates sat frozen solid with uneaten food, and the fireplace was stone cold, its ashes untouched for days. The bedroom was no different. Blankets thrown aside, drawers half open, clothes scattered as if someone had packed in haste and never returned. Thomas searched for clues, signs of violence, blood, footprints, but there was only emptiness and the biting cold pressing through every room. Outside, the barn offered a more heartbreaking sight. The animals were dead, frozen from neglect, the horses, chickens, and cattle all lifeless. It was as though the entire farm had been abandoned overnight. Realizing the gravity of what he had found, Thomas wasted no time. He mounted his horse and rode hard back to Mechanicsburg, where he met with the local sheriff, William Porter, a man known for his steady temperament and sharp attention to detail. Within hours, Porter assembled a small group of men and rode out to the Hartley farm to investigate. Their search raised more questions than answers. There were no signs of forced entry or theft, no clear evidence of a crime. Yet it was unthinkable that James and Margaret would vanish without a trace in the dead of winter. In the barn, Porter noticed tracks. Faint wheel marks pressed into the frozen ground, as if a wagon had been moved days earlier. But where could the Hartleys have gone, and why had no one heard from them? In a small community like Mechanicsburg, people noticed everything. A trip, especially in severe weather, would have been talked about immediately. Neighbors told the sheriff that they hadn't seen the couple in nearly 2 weeks. The last person to speak with James was the general store owner, who remembered a short exchange about buying seeds for spring planting. He recalled that James seemed preoccupied, but not unusually so. Margaret, meanwhile, had grown noticeably quieter in recent months, though no one thought much of it at the time. As days passed, the story spread like wildfire across central Illinois. Newspapers picked up the mystery, printing descriptions of the missing couple and asking for information. The Springfield Journal dedicated half a page to the disappearance, calling it one of the most puzzling cases the county had ever seen. But despite growing public attention, no trace of the Hartleys emerged. It was as though they had vanished into the frozen air of that merciless January. When Sheriff Porter returned to the farmhouse for a second, more detailed search, he found something that deepened the mystery even further. Inside James's desk drawer lay a stack of letters and notes, correspondence with people from other states, financial records hinting at business dealings that had nothing to do with farming, and a small notebook filled with unfamiliar names. Among the papers, one letter stood out. Dated November 1903, it seemed to hold the first real clue to the Hartleys' disappearance. The letter was dated just 2 months before the Hartleys vanished. It had come from St. Louis, Missouri, written by someone who signed only with cryptic initials that investigators couldn't immediately identify. The wording was vague, but its tone carried a sense of urgency. It spoke of a unique opportunity that James supposedly couldn't afford to miss, and referred to a meeting that was to take place when winter comes. The author also insisted that James tell no one about it, not even his wife. This discovery completely shifted the investigation's course. Sheriff Porter began to wonder whether the Hartleys' disappearance was not the result of foul play, but rather a planned departure. Perhaps James had been involved in questionable dealings and had left in haste to escape trouble. Yet, that theory didn't make sense either. Why would Margaret have vanished as well? And if they had truly fled, why abandon all their belongings, their livestock, and even their savings, which Porter later discovered hidden in a tin container buried in the barn? Determined to find answers, Porter sent telegrams to law enforcement in St. Louis asking for any records or leads related to a man named James Hartley. Communication was slow in those days, and nearly 2 weeks passed before he received a reply. When it finally arrived, it provided fragments of information that only deepened the mystery. There were mentions of a James Hartley involved in disputed business transactions years earlier, but nothing definitive, no proof that it was the same man. Once again, the case seemed to spiral into dead ends. Meanwhile, rumors spread rapidly through Mechanicsburg and the neighboring farms. The lack of clear answers fueled wild speculation. Some residents claimed to have seen unfamiliar faces around the area in the weeks before the couple vanished. One farmer swore he had heard shouting from the direction of the Hartley property on a cold December night, but had dismissed it as a quarrel carried on the wind. Another villager remembered spotting an unfamiliar wagon rolling past at dusk, heading toward the Hartleys' land. But no one could say who it belonged to. The brutal winter made any extensive search almost impossible. Sheriff Porter organized volunteer groups to comb through the frozen countryside, trudging through knee-deep snow and dense woods that bordered the farms, hoping to find some trace of the couple. They checked frozen creeks, fearing the worst, but nature hid all evidence beneath layers of ice and frost. Nothing turned up. Then, in early February, just as the weather began to soften, a new lead surfaced. A traveling horse trader who made regular trips between Springfield and Decatur, reported something intriguing. He had seen a man and woman matching the Hartleys' description at an inn in Decatur toward the end of January. They weren't alone. A younger man accompanied them, someone he didn't recognize. The trio had appeared tense and in a hurry, paying in cash before leaving early the next morning, supposedly heading south. Porter wasted no time. With 2 deputies, he rode to Decatur, a much larger town in Macon County, serving as a crossroads for those traveling between major cities. The inn the trader mentioned stood close to the train depot, a bustling spot filled with travelers coming and going. The perfect place for someone to disappear into the crowd. The innkeeper, an elderly man named Edmund Price, confirmed the story. He remembered the couple clearly because the woman seemed terrified, barely speaking a word during their stay. Her husband, or the man he assumed was her husband, handled everything, paying for the room in advance. The third man, the younger companion, lingered outside while arrangements were made. Edmund described him as being in his early 20s, plainly dressed but clean, looking like someone accustomed to travel. That night, Edmund had overheard muffled voices from the couple's room, the woman crying, the man's voice raised in agitation. He couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a heated argument. When the group came down to leave in the morning, Margaret, if it was indeed her, kept her eyes downcast, avoiding all contact. Edmund hadn't thought much of it at the time. Travelers had their own troubles, and he had long since learned not to meddle. When asked where they were headed, the innkeeper said only that they'd mentioned catching a train, though not which one. Decatur Station connected in several directions, north to Chicago, southwest to St. Louis, and east toward Indianapolis. Without knowing the exact destination, or whether they even boarded, Porter realized that following their trail would be next to impossible. At the train station, he questioned clerks and porters who had been on duty during that period. One ticket agent vaguely remembered selling passes to a small group matching the description, but couldn't recall details. Hundreds of passengers passed through daily, many using aliases or paying in cash. The Decatur lead, which had initially sparked hope, soon faded into yet another frustrating dead end. If the people seen at the inn really were James and Margaret Hartley, then they were alive, and clearly fleeing. But why? And who was the mysterious young man traveling with them? Sheriff Porter began to suspect that the couple hadn't left of their own free will. Perhaps they had been coerced, forced to abandon everything under threat. Back in Mechanicsburg, the sheriff shared his findings with the townspeople. Theories multiplied overnight. Some believed James had gotten mixed up in criminal affairs and was now on the run. Others whispered about a possible love affair gone wrong. A few even speculated that Margaret had been mentally unstable and dragged her husband into some delusional escape. Yet, none of these explanations fully made sense. In March, the Springfield Journal published a detailed feature on the case, complete with sketches of the missing couple and renewed appeals for information. The article captured the public's attention across Illinois and neighboring states. Letters poured in from readers claiming to have seen the Hartleys, but every report collapsed under scrutiny. The trail grew colder by the week. By the time spring began to stir the frozen ground, public interest had shifted to other news. But for Sheriff Porter and those who knew the couple, the mystery lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. The Hartley farm stood silent and desolate, its fields unplanted, its windows staring blankly across the thawing land, a haunting reminder of lives abruptly erased. Then, in mid-April 1904, as the snowmelt filled the streams and rivers, a discovery reignited the case. Near the banks of the Sangamon River, roughly 10 miles from the abandoned farm, a group of fishermen from the nearby town of Athens stumbled upon something half buried in the mud. A waterlogged suitcase, exposed by shifting spring currents. The men brought it to the local sheriff, who immediately contacted Porter. When the case was opened, everyone present was stunned. Inside were several articles of women's clothing, fine dresses, neatly folded but soaked through, some with Springfield store tags still attached. There was also a small box containing modest but valuable jewelry, including a distinctive brooch that several Mechanicsburg women instantly recognized. It was Margaret Hartley's. The same brooch she always wore to Sunday services, a keepsake from her late mother. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. If the Hartleys had fled willingly, why would Margaret have left behind such personal and valuable items? And why had the suitcase turned up so far from the supposed route toward Decatur? Sheriff Porter launched a new search along the Sangamon River. Volunteers combed the muddy banks for miles, hoping to find additional evidence, or in the worst case, remains. They followed the river south, through Athens and into more populated regions, but after days of searching, nothing else surfaced. The mysterious suitcase was all that remained, a single, silent clue in a case that refused to rest. The suitcase stood as a lonely enigma, a puzzle piece that refused to fit anywhere. Sheriff Porter, unwilling to let the mystery fade, decided it was time to start from the very beginning. He returned once more to the Hartley farmhouse, now cloaked in early spring growth, weeds pushing through the thawing earth and ivy creeping up its silent walls. The house looked as if it had been frozen in time, an abandoned monument to unanswered questions. Determined to uncover what had been missed, Porter and his men conducted a painstaking room-by-room search. Days into the renewed investigation, one of his deputies made a discovery that would change everything. In the basement, behind a shelf stacked with dusty jars of preserved fruit and vegetables, was a small hollow in the stone foundation. Inside, wrapped tightly in oilcloth to ward off moisture, was a diary belonging to Margaret Hartley. The first entries dated back to 1901 and continued sporadically until December 1903, only a few weeks before she vanished. The handwriting was graceful but steady, every page revealing glimpses of a woman far more complex than the quiet, dutiful figure the town believed her to be. Margaret's writing spoke of deep loneliness, of isolation so complete it seemed to erode her spirit. She hinted at secrets that weighed heavily on her mind, things she could not speak of, even to the people closest to her. In an entry from September 1903, Margaret described frequent arguments with James, disputes centered on money and his growing involvement in business dealings she didn't approve of. She never specified what these ventures were, but she made mention of strangers visiting the farm late at night, men who arrived under cover of darkness and departed before sunrise. As the weeks passed, her tone grew increasingly anxious. She wrote of feeling watched, of sensing that something terrible was drawing closer to their lives. The final entry, dated December 18, 1903, was nearly illegible, hurriedly written, the ink smudged in places. Margaret mentioned a decision James had made without consulting her, one she believed would change everything. She described a visitor, a man from James's past, who had appeared at the farm that very afternoon, bringing news that left her husband visibly shaken. Her final sentences hinted at fear and resignation, as though she sensed that escape was no longer possible. The entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if something, or someone, had interrupted her writing. Porter took the diary back to Mechanicsburg and spent days poring over every page. The deeper he read, the clearer the picture became. The Hartleys' marriage had been under enormous strain, and their seemingly peaceful life concealed a web of secrecy and dread. But the diary raised as many questions as it answered. Who were these men that came by night? What sort of dealings had James entangled himself in? And who exactly was the mysterious visitor from his past? Determined to find out, Sheriff Porter began digging into James Hartley's background. Until then, everyone in the community had assumed he was just another farmer who had drifted into Illinois years ago, seeking a quiet life. But where had he come from before that? Porter sent letters to authorities in surrounding counties and neighboring states, describing the missing man and requesting any information that might connect to him. By May, responses began arriving, and what they revealed startled him. Records from Henderson County, Kentucky, described a James Hartley implicated in a financial scandal in 1897, a man accused of orchestrating fraudulent investments that ruined several local families. That James had disappeared before investigators could bring him in for questioning. The physical description matched closely enough to raise alarm. Another report came from Indiana, where someone bearing the same name had been investigated in 1899 for smuggling goods across state lines. Once again, before any charges could be filed, the suspect vanished without a trace. The pattern was impossible to ignore. It seemed increasingly likely that the man known in Mechanicsburg as James Hartley was not the honest farmer he pretended to be, but rather a fugitive from his own past. This revelation reshaped the entire investigation. If James had indeed been running from old crimes, Then his secretive behavior, the late-night visitors, the hidden correspondence, the sudden disappearance, all began to make grim sense. Perhaps his past had finally caught up with him that winter. But where did that leave Margaret? Was she complicit in his deceptions, or simply another victim caught in their wake? The diary seemed to portray her as the latter. Her words reflected fear, confusion, and a growing sense that she no longer truly knew the man she'd married. To learn more, Porter searched marriage records in Springfield and confirmed that James and Margaret had wed in 1898, not long after James had arrived in Illinois. Before her marriage, she had gone by the name Margaret Mitchell. Tracing that name led Porter to a small town in Ohio, where he contacted local authorities. Their reply added another layer of sorrow to the story. The Mitchell family confirmed that Margaret had left Ohio after her parents' deaths in 1897, writing in her last letters that she intended to travel west and had met a man she hoped to marry. Communication dwindled after that. The final letter her sister received was dated 1899, cheerful, full of talk about the farm and dreams of building a home. Nothing in it suggested danger or unhappiness. So what had changed between that letter and the fearful diary entries of 1903? Somewhere in those intervening years, illusions had been shattered. Margaret had uncovered something about her husband, something that terrified her and left her feeling trapped. Porter began assembling a timeline. James had likely fled Kentucky in 1897 or 1898, hiding under a new identity in Illinois. There he met Margaret, a young, grieving woman seeking a new start. They married, bought land, and for a few years lived quietly, blending into the rhythm of rural life. But around 1902 or 1903, James's past began to resurface. Strange visitors began arriving after dark, money exchanged hands. And then in December 1903, a man from his past appeared, setting in motion the events that would end in disappearance. Porter's theory was taking shape. The Hartleys hadn't simply vanished. They had been forced into a desperate situation. James may have been blackmailed, threatened, or pressured to flee, taking Margaret with him. But certain elements still refused to make sense. Why had Margaret's belongings been discarded in the Sangamon River, in the opposite direction from Decatur? If they were escaping, why abandon her jewelry, sentimental items she cherished? As spring turned to summer, a new lead emerged from an unexpected source. In June 1904, a man named Robert Hayes, a railroad worker who had been bedridden for months, finally learned of the case through the local papers. Convinced he might know something, Hayes traveled to Mechanicsburg to speak with Sheriff Porter in person. Hayes explained that on a freezing night in mid-January, he couldn't recall the exact date, perhaps the 12th or 13th, he had been inspecting a remote stretch of railway near an area known as Clear Lake. The temperature was brutally low, the air sharp enough to sting with every breath. While walking the line, Hayes had noticed a wagon parked beside the tracks. Unusual at that hour and in that weather. There were 3 figures near it, 2 men and a woman. One of the men, older and visibly agitated, kept pacing near the tracks, glancing down the line as though expecting something to arrive. The younger man tended to the horses, keeping them steady in the bitter wind. The woman sat motionless in the wagon bed, wrapped tightly in blankets. From where Hayes stood, he couldn't see her face clearly. The darkness and swirling snow made it impossible. But her stillness struck him as strange. She didn't move or even seem to react to the cold. At first, Hayes considered calling out or offering help. But something about the tense, secretive atmosphere made him uneasy. Instinct told him to keep his distance. So, quietly, he slipped away into the night, unaware that what he'd witnessed might be the final trace of the Hartleys alive. There was a distinct heaviness in the air, a wordless tension that warned Robert Hayes his presence would not be welcome. Trusting his instincts, he chose not to interfere. He continued along the tracks, finishing his inspection under the pale glow of his lantern. When he retraced his steps nearly an hour later, the wagon was gone, leaving behind only faint wheel ruts half filled with snow. For a few days, the strange encounter lingered in his mind. But with no reason to think more of it, Hayes eventually dismissed the scene as nothing more than weary travelers braving the brutal January cold. Months later, when he came across newspaper stories detailing the disappearance of James and Margaret Hartley, the memory resurfaced with chilling clarity. The image of the motionless woman wrapped in blankets and the restless man pacing near the tracks suddenly carried new meaning. he realized he might have witnessed the missing couple's final hours of freedom. Hayes's testimony introduced a new and puzzling dimension to the investigation. Clear Lake lay between Mechanicsburg and the Sangamon River, yet it was far from the direct road to Decatur. Why would the Hartleys be at that isolated stretch of rail line so late at night? Sheriff Porter considered several explanations. Perhaps they had arranged to board a freight train from that remote spot. A way to slip away unseen, bypassing official depots where names could be recorded. Or perhaps they were waiting for someone arriving by train, someone connected to their sudden flight. Porter visited Clear Lake himself to study the setting. The place was bleak and wind-swept, a desolate pocket of land surrounded by dormant fields and thin clusters of bare trees. The railroad sliced through it like a scar, functional but lonely. Passenger service rarely ran through this section, though freight trains rumbled by now and then, carrying grain, lumber, and other goods between larger towns. It was, in every sense, the kind of place one might choose for a clandestine meeting. When Porter questioned other railway workers familiar with the route, one of them cautiously mentioned long-circulating rumors. On certain nights, he said, some freight trains carried more than legal cargo. Contraband alcohol, stolen merchandise, even stowaways trying to move undetected. These whispers were impossible to prove, but they sparked a new theory in Porter's mind. If James Hartley had indeed been mixed up in criminal dealings, perhaps he still had connections who could arrange covert transportation. The young man seen with the couple might have been a middleman, someone sent to ensure their safe passage or to coordinate their escape. That idea explained why witnesses had reported seeing the Hartleys near both Clear Lake and Decatur. They could have been switching routes, using different forms of transport to confuse anyone pursuing them. But the suitcase recovered from the Sangamon River still didn't fit into this narrative. The belongings inside, Margaret's clothes and jewelry, bore no trace of James's effects. It seemed unlikely the bag had been lost by accident. Porter began to suspect it had been discarded on purpose. If that were true, then someone had wanted those items to be found, or at least had no reason to hide them. The sheriff's thoughts turned darker. What if Margaret hadn't been traveling by choice at all? Witnesses had noted how anxious she seemed in Decatur, how silent and withdrawn. And according to Hayes, the woman in the wagon barely moved despite the frigid air, as though she were ill, restrained, or simply too frightened to react. Could James, desperate and cornered by his past, have done something terrible? This unsettling possibility drove Porter to reread Margaret's diary from the beginning. With every page, its final entries took on a new and ominous tone. She had written of decisions made without her input, of a growing sense that danger was closing in. While she never explicitly said she feared her husband, the dread between her lines was unmistakable. It was as though she sensed a calamity approaching, one she could neither prevent nor flee. Then, in July, a new thread appeared. Porter received a letter from a Springfield lawyer representing the bank that held the mortgage on the Hartley farm. The correspondence explained that the property had been purchased through a loan James never fully repaid. With months of unpaid installments and the owners missing, foreclosure proceedings were already underway. The attorney requested any updates on their whereabouts, since their status would determine how the case proceeded. The news reframed the financial side of the mystery. James Hartley, it seemed, had been undergoing monetary pressure, a motive powerful enough to push a man toward desperate measures. Porter requested bank statements from Springfield and quickly uncovered disturbing inconsistencies. In December 1903, James had nearly emptied his account through multiple withdrawals. Yet only days later, a large deposit appeared, far exceeding any legitimate income from farming. The origin of that money was a complete mystery. It didn't match any crop or livestock sales, nor any known business activity. Where had the funds come from? And if James had received such a sum, why did he abandon cash and savings still hidden in the barn? The transactions hinted at a major event in December. Perhaps a deal, a payoff, or even blackmail. Whatever the source, the money seemed tied to the shadowy visitors Margaret mentioned in her diary. Porter began to suspect that the funds came at a steep cost, a price that forced James to vanish soon after. Throughout the summer of 1904, Porter worked tirelessly to stitch these fragments into a coherent account. He began to see the outlines of a tragic narrative. James Hartley, a man with a stained past, had come to Illinois seeking a fresh start under false pretenses. Margaret, unaware of his history, had married him out of trust and hope. For a few quiet years they lived peacefully until the echoes of James's past sins found their way back to him. By late 1903, the walls were closing in. Under mounting pressure, James liquidated his finances, made arrangements with men who could help him disappear, and fled in the dead of winter, taking Margaret along, willing or not. They moved through back roads, avoiding towns and stations, likely switching from wagons to freight trains to stay hidden. Somewhere along that desperate journey, Margaret's personal items ended up in the river, either discarded to mislead pursuers or because something far worse had already occurred. It was a grim but plausible theory, one that explained much yet still left key gaps. If Margaret had been coerced, why hadn't she called for help at the inn? Why make no attempt to escape? Porter wondered if fear, or perhaps lingering devotion, had silenced her. The younger man accompanying them might have been acting as both guard and guide, ensuring she stayed compliant. Then came autumn, and with it, a stunning development. In September 1904, an urgent telegram arrived from law enforcement officials in Cairo, Illinois, a bustling port city where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers converged. The message was short and electrifying. A disoriented woman had been found wandering near the docks, unable to provide her name or any clear account of who she was. Her description matched that of Margaret Hartley. Without hesitation, Sheriff Porter boarded the first available train south. The journey took nearly 2 days, requiring multiple connections, each hour thick with anticipation. Cairo was a crossroads of trade and travel, a chaotic blend of steamboats, rail lines, and crowded wharves. It was the kind of place where a person could vanish amid the flow of strangers, and just as easily where lost souls might drift ashore unnoticed. Upon arriving, Porter went straight to the sheriff's office and was directed to a modest infirmary near the waterfront. Inside, resting in a narrow bed beneath thin blankets, was a woman whose identity needed no confirmation. It was indeed Margaret Hartley, though the years and horrors she had endured had left her transformed. Her once neat hair was unevenly cropped and tangled. Her clothes were coarse and worn, nothing like the respectable garments she had worn back in Mechanicsburg. When Porter stepped forward and spoke her name, she stared at him blankly, as though struggling to place him. He introduced himself softly, mentioning the farm, the town, familiar names from home. Slowly, recognition flickered in her eyes. Trembling tears welled on her cheeks, and she began to speak. She trembled, and the sheriff waited with steady patience as the fog in her eyes slowly cleared. At last, in a voice no louder than a whisper, she spoke her own name, the first coherent sound since her rescue, and for the first time since being found days before, a hint of lucidity returned. The local physician told Porter that Margaret was a wreck of body and mind, emaciated, showing the marks of prolonged exposure and poor nourishment, not visibly maimed but profoundly exhausted and fragile. Her thoughts came in fits and starts, long silences punctuated by agitation and half-formed phrases about rivers, travels, and places whose names she could not summon. Porter stayed in Cairo for several days, visiting her each morning, and slowly, like someone picking at the edges of a torn map, she began to hand him fragments of their winter. She confirmed they had not left the farm of their own accord. Men had come to the Hartley place in the weeks before, making brutal demands James could not meet. He owed money, more than Margaret had ever known, and the debts came with men who were not inclined to mercy. One night James woke her abruptly and told her they must go at once. There was no time to pack properly, only hurried shoves of clothing into a suitcase and a cart waiting with a young helper James called, or man to move us. Margaret remembered the cold, the constant sense of being pursued, and the peculiar stillness of the night when they waited by the tracks. The same lonely stretch Robert Hayes had later described. They boarded an empty freight car when it slowed, and that journey became, in Margaret's fractured memory, a blur of hunger and fear. Freezing hours in an unheated car, abrupt stops, and a hurried unloading near a place she later learned was Decatur. It was there, amid confusion and hushed argument between James and the young man, that her bag went missing. She could not recall the precise moment, only that it had been left behind and later, somehow, ended up in the river, They spent a night at the Decatur Inn exactly as Edmund Price had said, Margaret too exhausted to protest, James and the youth whispering plans she was not privy to. By morning they travelled again, sometimes passing as ordinary passengers under assumed names. James produced false papers, a revelation that shocked her and deepened her sense of betrayal. They drifted south in fits and starts, stopping in cheap lodgings and taking occasional, precarious work to stretch dwindling funds. The young man who had accompanied them vanished one night without warning. Margaret awoke to find him gone, and thereafter it was only her and James, his behavior unraveling into paranoia and despair. At some point, she could not say when, they reached Cairo, a noisy, chaotic river town so unlike the quiet of Mechanicsburg. James told her they must find passage on a boat that would carry them farther downriver, perhaps all the way to New Orleans, and he grew more restless and sleepless as the hours passed. Then, one morning, she woke alone. James had left to arrange travel and never returned. Days of waiting turned to the dreadful certainty that he had abandoned her, with no money, no papers, and no one she trusted. Margaret's mind gave way. She wandered the docks and streets, bewildered and unable to answer questions, until kind strangers brought her to the authorities. Porter's interviews in Cairo turned up only vague sightings. Boarders and dockhands who thought they'd seen a man matching James's description. Captains who could not confirm passengers because records were irregular and cash fares common. And the river offered too many routes and too many opportunities to vanish. Margaret was too weak to travel, so Porter stayed to oversee her care and to pry more recollections from her fractured memory. She spoke of towns and fleeting faces, and Porter wrote everything down, hoping that some small detail, a name, a landmark, a scrap of conversation, might eventually point him to where James had gone or to those men who had forced the Hartleys from their home. Any trace of James remained unaccounted for. Margaret's story and his investigation would never truly find closure. As Margaret's health improved, Porter dedicated himself entirely to chasing down the leads she had shared. One detail in particular drew his attention. She recalled that while they were staying in a small town south of Decatur, James had received a telegram that had left him visibly shaken. Margaret hadn't known what it said, but she remembered the moment vividly, the way James had read it over and over before tossing it into the fire, his face pale and drawn. That image stayed with her. Porter traced the town she described, Centria, a modest settlement in Marion County, and traveled there himself. After explaining his purpose, he gained permission to review the local telegraph records from the period in question. It was a tedious task, like combing through sand for a single grain, but persistence rewarded him. Eventually, he found a telegram that stood out, sent from St. Louis in February 1904 and addressed to J. Hart. It contained only a few ominous words: agreement broken, situation untenable, no way back. The message was signed with unfamiliar initials, but its meaning was unmistakable. Whoever had written it was warning of disaster, the collapse of some secret understanding. If J. Hart was indeed James Hartley, it explained much. It would account for his growing desperation after receiving the message, his restless movement from town to town, and his final decision to flee the state entirely. Porter knew he needed to follow that trail back to St. Louis. The sprawling river city was unlike any other place he had investigated. Crowded, noisy, and teeming with faces. Finding one man's pass there felt nearly impossible. Still, Porter began where the telegram had originated, the telegraph office by the river. The clerk on duty no longer remembered who had sent it, but the address listed in the ledger pointed Porter toward a commercial district crowded with warehouses, shipping offices, and taverns. For days he walked the streets, speaking with merchants, dock workers, and innkeepers. Finally, a lead surfaced in a dim tavern run by a German immigrant named Hinrich Müller. The man remembered James, though he had gone by another name. Hinrich said James used to drink there with a rough crowd, gamblers, smugglers, and lenders who preyed on desperation. These were men, Hinrich warned, better not to know too well. According to local rumor, James had fallen into deep debt with these people, and in a reckless attempt to escape his obligations, had double-crossed them. There had been a confrontation, the details of which Hinrich never learned, and afterward, James vanished from St. Louis. That disappearance had occurred around 1897 or 1898, which fit perfectly with the year James first appeared in Illinois, newly respectable, newly married. The pieces were finally aligning. James Hartley hadn't been an unlucky farmer who stumbled into debt. He had been a fugitive all along, carrying a past full of lies and danger. The mysterious visitors to the Hartley farm, the men Margaret had feared, were most likely agents of those same criminals, come to collect on old debts long overdue. From Hinrich, Porter gathered a few names connected to James's old associates. Many were already dead or imprisoned, but one stood out, a figure known only as Dalton. According to Hinrich, Dalton was a ruthless man who controlled much of the illicit trade along the St. Louis waterfront. If James had crossed him, his flight and terror made perfect sense. Tracking Dalton proved impossible. He seemed more legend than man. Everyone claimed to know of him, but no one admitted to knowing him personally. He worked through layers of intermediaries, his name whispered but never signed. Porter realized he was dealing with someone who had built an empire of shadows protected by fear and secrecy. Disheartened but not defeated, Porter returned to Cairo by late October. Margaret had improved remarkably. She had regained weight, and the haunted look in her eyes had softened. She spoke more clearly now, though certain memories still unsettled her. The doctor pronounced her fit for travel, provided the journey was gentle. Porter arranged for her return to Mechanicsburg, a long trip north through the changing autumn landscape. Margaret was anxious about going home. After everything she had endured, she feared the town's judgment more than its sympathy. Porter reassured her that most people had followed her story with concern, not condemnation. When they finally arrived in November, the townsfolk's reactions were mixed. Some embraced her with genuine warmth, others watched from a distance, whispering about what she might truly know of her husband's affairs. The Hartley farm remained standing, though choked with weeds and neglect. Margaret refused to enter it. To her, the place was no longer a home, but a graveyard of memories. Members of her church took her in while she considered what to do next. The bank was finalizing foreclosure, and soon the property would be gone altogether. Through the winter, Porter continued his search for James. He sent telegrams and letters to lawmen along the Mississippi, sharing descriptions and urging them to stay alert. His instinct told him James had gone farther south, to the kind of city where a man could vanish among the crowds. In December 1904, nearly a year after James and Margaret's disappearance, that instinct proved correct. A report arrived from New Orleans. A man fitting James Hartley's description had been seen along the waterfront, sometimes working as a longshoreman, living in shabby boarding houses, and keeping to himself. The report came from a local officer who had read about the Illinois case in a traveling newspaper. Porter debated making the journey himself, but winter conditions made it perilous. Moreover, James wasn't formally wanted in Illinois, morally guilty, yes, but not legally. Unless Missouri had outstanding warrants from his earlier crimes, there was little ground to detain him. So Porter did the only thing he could. He provided all his findings to New Orleans authorities and asked them to keep watch. He thought about telling Margaret, but he couldn't bring himself to. She was finally beginning to heal, teaching sewing and craftwork at the small school, earning her own modest income, rediscovering calm. Telling her that James might still be alive, lingering somewhere along the river, would only reopen old wounds. And so, as the year drew to a close and snow began to dust the fields around Mechanicsburg, Margaret quietly rebuilt her life, while Sheriff Porter kept one eye on the river, waiting, hoping, and wondering whether James Hartley's past would ever truly stay buried beneath its shifting current. Also the peace and dignity of the woman who had stood beside him. He spoke of debts that could never truly be repaid, not to the men who hunted him, but to Margaret herself. "If there is any mercy left for me," one line read shakily, "it will be in knowing you are safe, far from the ruin I've made." Sheriff Porter read the letter several times, his hands steady but his thoughts racing. The tone was unmistakably sincere, stripped of the deceit that had long characterized James Hartley's actions. It was not a confession in the legal sense, but it was the truest testament of guilt Porter had yet encountered. What struck him most was a final, incomplete sentence. "They've found me again. I can't." The words stopped abruptly, the ink trailing into a dark blot, as if the writer had been interrupted. The discovery added both clarity and mystery. It confirmed that James had indeed reached Vicksburg, living under a false identity, and seemingly aware that his time was running out. The mention of being found again suggested that the men from St. Louis, or their associates, had finally caught up with him. Yet no one in Vicksburg had reported any suspicious deaths, no bodies had surfaced in the river, and there were no signs of a violent struggle in his rented room. Porter and Sheriff Garrett expanded the investigation to the surrounding areas. They interviewed boatmen, dock workers, and traders who regularly moved up and down the river. One steamboat captain recalled a man resembling James boarding his vessel in late January, quiet, reserved, and paying cash for a one-way ticket south toward Natchez. After that, there was no further record of him. Whether he disembarked before reaching Natchez or was thrown overboard into the river's depths, no one could say. Porter lingered in Vicksburg for several days, haunted by the sense that he was following the faintest traces of a ghost. The river itself seemed to mock him, calm on the surface but concealing countless secrets beneath. When he finally returned to Illinois, he carried the unsent letter and a few of James's possessions back to Mechanicsburg. Margaret received the news with a quiet that was almost reverent. She read the letter in silence, her expression unreadable until tears began to form. She didn't ask to keep the original, only a copy. Let it stay with the sheriff, she told Porter softly, as proof that he finally understood what he'd done. In the months that followed, the case once again began to fade from public attention. Newspapers reported briefly on the Vicksburg findings, but soon moved on to newer stories. For the people of Mechanicsburg, life resumed its steady rhythm. Margaret continued her teaching, her demeanor gentler but somehow stronger. Those who once pitied her now admired her resilience. Sheriff Porter, however, could not let the matter rest completely. He reviewed the files late at night, tracing the same paths again and again, from the frozen Illinois fields to the sweltering docks of New Orleans, then down to the muddy waters of the Mississippi. Each step told the story of a man trying to outrun his past, and a woman whose quiet endurance stood in tragic contrast. By autumn of 1905, Porter finally closed his formal investigation. His final report was concise: James Hartley presumed deceased. Circumstances consistent with disappearance by drowning, motive, flight from criminal associates. Case unresolved, but all available evidence supports conclusion of death. Yet even as he sealed the file, Porter knew the truth was more complicated. The Mississippi had swallowed many lives, but it had also given birth to myths. Stories of redemption, disappearance, and reinvention. Somewhere deep inside, he wondered if James Hartley had really perished, or if he had found one final escape along the endless river. For Margaret, life slowly found a quieter rhythm. She remained in Mechanicsburg, never remarrying, devoting her time to teaching and charitable work. Her story became one of whispered legend. The woman who survived love, loss, and the dangerous tide of secrets. And though years passed, there were nights when she stood by the edge of the Sangamon River, watching the moonlight shimmer on the current, and whispered a name the water would carry downstream, to the Mississippi, to the Gulf, and to whatever remained of the man she had once called her husband. Was known about James Hartley. Porter arranged for the few remaining personal effects to be shipped to Illinois for examination. When the items arrived, he studied them with meticulous care. The corroded watch, the water, damaged scraps of paper, the remnants of a once fine coat now little more than tatters. Everything pointed toward the same grim but inevitable conclusion: the river had finally surrendered its secret. Porter did not rush to inform Margaret. He spent several days verifying the details, consulting with the Louisiana authorities, and comparing their records against his own files. There was no absolute proof. No clear identification could be made. But in the absence of any other plausible explanation, the evidence was as close to conclusive as anyone could hope for. When he finally called on Margaret, it was with the solemn patience of a man who understood the weight of the news he carried. They met in her modest sitting room, where sunlight streamed through lace curtains and softened the edges of the past. Margaret listened in silence as Porter explained what had been found. When he showed her the pocket watch, her expression barely changed at first. Then, slowly, her hand reached out to touch the tarnished metal. "It was his," she said softly, her voice almost detached, as though speaking of someone long ago forgotten. "I gave it to him on our first anniversary. That was all she said for a long while. The ticking of the clock on the mantel filled the room, a quiet echo of the heartbeat that had once belonged to a man she had loved, or thought she had loved. At last she spoke again, her words calm and steady. "Now the river can have its peace," she said. "And so can I." Porter nodded. He could see that Margaret's grief had transformed over time into something quieter. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but acceptance. She no longer looked like the fragile woman who had once faced the gossip of a small town with trembling hands and tearful eyes. There was a strength about her now, forged through years of endurance and the slow, deliberate process of rebuilding a life. In his final report, written later that week, Porter summarized the finding with professional restraint: remains recovered near the Mississippi Delta believed to be those of James Hartley. Identification supported by personal effects. Case concluded. He placed the file among others in the cabinet, though he knew this one would never truly fade from memory. It was more than a case. It was a lesson in the cost of deceit, the reach of redemption, and the persistence of human endurance. As for Margaret, the years that followed brought quiet stability. She continued teaching, her students remembering her as patient but firm, her lessons always tinged with compassion. She became a mentor to younger teachers and a trusted voice in community matters. Those who knew her well said she rarely spoke of her past, though sometimes, when the wind carried the distant sound of the river, she would pause and stare toward the horizon, as if listening for something. Porter visited her occasionally, even after his retirement, their conversations easy and marked by mutual respect. Once, during one such visit, he admitted that part of him had always wondered what really happened in those final hours by the river. Margaret smiled faintly and replied, "Perhaps it's better not to know everything. Some truths are meant to stay with the water." By the time Porter passed away years later, the Hartley case had become little more than a local legend, a story retold by townsfolk who had long since forgotten its pain. Yet in Mechanicsburg, where the quiet fields stretched toward the river's edge, the tale still lingered like a whisper carried on the current. And sometimes, when the Mississippi ran high and the moonlight turned the water silver, the people who lived along its banks swore they could see the faint outline of a man standing at the shore, not in fear or flight this time, but in peace, watching the river that had both destroyed and redeemed him drift endlessly toward the sea. Every time he turned the small band of gold between his fingers, he was reminded of how fragile the line between love and ruin could be. The engraving, JH and MM, had faded slightly, worn smooth by time and the weight of memory. It was, to Porter, less a token of affection than a relic of choices that had destroyed lives and reshaped others. He wrote a final entry in his private ledger, a note never intended for official records. Confession confirms James Hartley's death by human hands, not the river's will. Justice achieved in truth if not in law. Case closed not for the county but for conscience. With that, he placed the ring back into its small box and locked it away among his personal effects, a symbol of the story's quiet end. As the years passed, the Hartley affair faded completely from public memory. Mechanicsburg grew into a peaceful little town where no one spoke much of the past. New families came, farms expanded, and the whispers that had once followed Margaret Mitchell Hartley Sullivan disappeared entirely. The old Hartley property thrived under new ownership, fields heavy with grain, laughter echoing from a rebuilt porch. No trace remained of the sorrow that had once shadowed that land. Margaret, now Mrs. Sullivan, lived a life of calm purpose. She and Robert shared a partnership grounded in understanding rather than passion, a union built on trust, patience, and shared respect. She continued teaching, becoming a cornerstone of the local school and an example of quiet integrity to the next generation. Her stepchildren adored her, calling her Mother, long before she felt worthy of the title. For the first time in her life, she truly belonged somewhere. There were, however, quiet moments when memory returned. On rainy nights, when the wind carried the faint scent of the river, Margaret would find herself staring into the distance, thinking of another life, one filled with fear, betrayal, and the desperate hope that love might save what was already doomed. Those thoughts no longer wounded her, but they reminded her of the cost of illusion. She had learned to forgive not only James, but herself, for the years spent believing in him. Sheriff Porter lived out his retirement in quiet dignity. Age slowed him, but his mind remained sharp, haunted at times by echoes of cases that had refused tidy endings. Yet of them all, the Hartley story lingered longest. It was to him less a mystery solved than a parable of human weakness and endurance. Occasionally, he would take out the old files, read through his own handwriting, and think about the strange mercy of time. How it erases pain without ever quite removing its shape. In the spring of 1915, Margaret visited him one last time. Robert had passed away the year before, and though grief had touched her again, it was a gentler sorrow, one softened by years of shared happiness. They sat together on Porter's porch, the afternoon sun warm on the boards. Conversation wandered easily from the school to the town's growth, and eventually to the past. When the topic of James Hartley surfaced, Margaret did not flinch. "I sometimes wonder," she said softly, "if he ever truly understood the harm he caused, or if he believed he was doing the right thing until the very end." Porter hesitated before replying. "From what I've learned, he knew. Maybe not from the start, but before it was over. I think that's why he ran, not just from others, but from himself." Margaret nodded, her eyes distant but peaceful. "Then perhaps he found his own kind of reckoning. That's enough for me." When she rose to leave, Porter went inside and retrieved the small box he had kept for nearly a decade. He handed it to her without explanation. She opened it, stared at the ring for a long time, and then smiled faintly. "I thought this was gone forever." "Some things," Porter said quietly, "find their way back when they're meant to." That evening, after she left, Porter watched from his porch as she walked down the dusty road, her figure framed by the fading gold of the setting sun. He knew he would not see her again, but he also knew the story was finally at rest. Every question answered, every ghost given peace. Years later, when Porter himself passed on, his widow found among his effects a single note written in his hand. "The river keeps many secrets, but not all forever. Some it returns, in truth, in forgiveness, in peace." And so it was. The story of James and Margaret Hartley became part of local legend, told in hushed tones by old-timers who no longer remembered the facts clearly. Only that once, long ago, a woman in Mechanicsburg had loved a man whose past rose like the Mississippi itself, deep, dark, and unstoppable, and yet had somehow managed to survive it. Broken vows, fractured destinies, yet also endurance and rebirth. Margaret had managed to rediscover happiness, rebuilding a life of meaning from the ruins of her past. Though her memories could never be erased, her journey became a testament to the strength of the human spirit and its ability to heal. By 1915, Sheriff Porter decided to properly organize all the material he had gathered on the Hartley case. He spent long, reflective weeks poring over files, sorting evidence, and arranging reports in order, carefully adding notes to clarify timelines and motives. His goal was not fame or recognition, but preservation, ensuring that the truth of what happened would not vanish with time. He felt that the case was more than a tale of crime and tragedy. It revealed something deeply human about choices, guilt, redemption, and the unpredictable ways life could unravel. When his work was complete, Porter sealed the files, leaving specific instructions that they should remain closed for 50 years. He wanted to make sure that Margaret and everyone directly touched by the case could live out their lives in peace before the story became public knowledge. The documents were placed securely in the county archives, where they sat in quiet obscurity, protecting secrets that once shook a small Illinois town. Margaret spent the rest of her life in Mechanicsburg, surrounded by kindness and respect. She passed away peacefully in 1947 at the age of 72, having built a life filled with love, purpose, and quiet strength. Only a handful of people at her funeral truly knew the depth of her story, and they kept that knowledge sacred. Her husband, Robert Sullivan, followed her in death 3 years later. The two were buried side by side in a modest cemetery overlooking the rolling hills. Their graves simple and serene, marked only by their names, dates, and a short inscription about love's endurance. There was no mention of James Hartley, the winter of 1904, or the desperate months that had once defined her life. That part of her story was laid to rest, sealed in both memory and earth. When the Porter files were finally opened in the 1960s, historians were stunned by their detail. They uncovered one of Illinois' most haunting and complex criminal cases, carefully recorded by a lawman who refused to let truth fade into rumor. Researchers studied the case for its layers of deception, tragedy, and the remarkable resilience of the woman at its center. Some wrote scholarly papers, while others retold it in books and documentaries. The Hartley case returned to public awareness, transformed by time into a historical legend rather than a living wound. The farm where everything began still stood, owned by the descendants of the family that had purchased it in 1905. They knew vaguely of the land's dark past, but it held no shadow over their daily lives. The fields remained abundant, the barn filled with modern machinery, and the home had been renovated beyond recognition. The soil that had once witnessed tragedy now yielded life again, a quiet redemption of place and memory. The Sangamon River still wound its way through the countryside, its waters whispering stories only nature could keep. The mighty Mississippi flowed onward, indifferent yet eternal, carrying with it the echoes of countless human dramas that had unfolded along its banks. Rivers have long memories, though they speak rarely and only in fragments. Mechanicsburg continued to evolve with the passing decades. Highways and commerce brought new faces and change. The Baptist church where Margaret once worshipped had been rebuilt twice, each time grander than before. The small school where she taught sewing had long since closed, merging with others as the town modernized. Time had erased the visible remnants of the early 1900s, but not the story that lingered in local memory. For those who studied it later, the Hartley case became a profound lesson about the fragility of identity, the hidden truths that inevitably resurface, and the rippling consequences of deceit. James Hartley was no monster, merely a man undone by his own choices, unable to escape the chain of lies he created. His downfall destroyed not only himself but nearly the woman who loved him. Yet Margaret's endurance turned despair into renewal, offering a glimmer of hope amid tragedy. The story also forces reflection on the nature of justice. James never faced trial or conviction, yet the repercussions of his actions found him nonetheless. Margaret, though denied legal restitution, achieved a more meaningful kind of justice, one built through healing love and a life reclaimed. Porter's files, now digitized and studied worldwide, reveal not only facts but empathy. His handwritten notes showed a man who saw beyond crime into humanity, who valued truth but tempered it with mercy. He became a symbol of integrity in law enforcement, understanding that behind every case lies a story of real human suffering and survival. Over time, the Hartley affair entered Illinois' folklore. Retellings evolved, details shifted, but the emotional truth endured. Even today, when the wind whistles over Mechanicsburg's winter fields, locals sometimes recall the vanished couple and the mysteries of that cold January in 1904, a reminder that beneath quiet surfaces, life can conceal the darkest and deepest tales. Before his death in 1932, Porter ensured the final chapter of the story found its place. He left instructions that the wedding ring Samuel Dalton had returned should be preserved with the files. When the archives were opened, the ring, inscribed J.H.M., was catalogued, photographed, and placed on display at the county museum. It rests there today in a glass case, a small object heavy with meaning, symbolizing love, betrayal, and the passage of time. Looking back more than a century later, the Hartley case offers a glimpse into a world both distant and familiar. Technology, communication, and law have evolved, but human nature has not. The same desires, fears, and mistakes continue to shape lives. If Margaret Hartley Sullivan could speak today, she might remind us that her tale was not unique, that betrayal, endurance, and renewal are timeless patterns in the human experience. The fields of Mechanicsburg still ripen each fall. The Sangamon River flows calmly through Illinois, and the Mississippi continues its eternal journey to the Gulf. Life persists, renewing, forgiving, forgetting. Yet as long as there are those who remember, the story of Margaret and James Hartley will live on, teaching us that truth is rarely simple, and that even from tragedy, hope can quietly grow. This remains one of the most haunting and intricate cases ever recorded. Proof that real life often surpasses fiction in its mystery and depth. If you followed this journey through time, loss and rediscovery, share your reflections below. What part of this story moved you most? If you enjoy tales like this, subscribe to explore more, for countless stories still rest, waiting to be uncovered, in the forgotten archives of history.